We're back with chapter 19 of The Sword in the Stone by T.H. White. In the evenings, except in the very height of summer, they used to meet in the solar after the last meal of the day. There the parson, Reverend Sidebottom, or if he were busy over his sermon, then Merlin himself would read them out of some learned book of tales to calm their spirits. It was glorious in the winter, while the big logs roared in the fire, the beech blew, flamy and relentless, the elm snowy and soon gone, the holly bright, or the pine with his smoking scents, while the dogs dreamed of conquest, or the boys imagined those sweet maidens letting down their golden hair so their rescuers might save them out of towers. But almost at any time of year it was good. The book they usually used was Gesta Romanorum, whose fascinating tales begin with such provoking sentences as, "There was a certain king who had a singular particularity for little dogs that barked loudly," or, "A certain nobleman had a white cow to whom he was extremely partial. He assigned 2 reasons to this. First, because she was spotlessly white, and next because the boys, and for that matter, the men, would sit as quiet as church mice while the marvels of the story were unfolded. And when the unpredictable narrative had come to an end, they would look toward Reverend Sidebottom, or Merlin, who was not so good at it, to have the story explained. Reverend Sidebottom would draw a deep breath and plunge into his task, explaining how the certain king was really Christ, and the barking dogs zealous preachers, or how the white cow was the soul, and her milk represented prayer and supplication. Sometimes, indeed generally, the unfortunate vicar was hard put to find a moral, but nobody else doubted his explanations were the right ones, and anyway, most of his listeners were soon asleep. It was a fine summer night, the last night which would give any excuse for fires, and Reverend Sidebottom was reading out his tale. Wart lay snoozing among the lean ribs of the gaze hounds. Sir Ector sipped his wine, with his eyes brooding on the logs which lit the evening. Kay played chess with himself rather badly, and Merlin, with his long beard, saffron in the firelight, sat cross-legged, knitting beside the Wart. "There was once discovered in Rome," read Reverend Sidebottom through his nose, "an uncorrupted body taller than the wall of a city, on which the following words were inscribed: Pallas, the son of Evander, whom the lance of a crooked soldier slew, is interned here. A candle burned at his head, which neither water nor wind could extinguish, until the air was admitted through a hole made with the point of a needle beneath the flame. The wound of which this giant had died was 4 feet and a half long. Having been killed after the overthrow of Troy, he remained in his tomb 2,240 years." "Have you ever seen a giant?" asked Merlin softly, so as not to interrupt the reading. "No, I remember you haven't. Just catch hold of my hand a moment and shut your eyes." The vicar was droning on about the gigantic son of Evander. Sir Ector was staring into the fire, and Kay was making a slight click as he moved one of the chessmen, but the Wart and Merlin were immediately standing hand in hand in an unknown forest. "This is the forest of Burbly Water," said Merlin, "and we are going to visit the giant Galapas. Now listen, you are invisible at this moment because you are holding my hand. I am able to keep myself invisible by an excuse of willpower. An exceedingly exhausting job it is, and I can keep you invisible as long as you hold on to me. It takes twice as much willpower, but there. If, however, you let go of me even for a moment, during that moment you will become visible, and if you do it in the presence of Galapas, he will munch you up in 2 bites, so hold on." "Very well," said the Wart. "Don't say very well. It isn't very well at all. On the contrary, it is very ill indeed. And another thing, the whole of this beastly wood is dotted with pitfalls, and I shall be grateful if you will look where you are going." "What sort of pitfalls?" "He digs a lot of pits about 10 feet deep with smooth clay walls, and covers them over with dead branches, pine needles, and such like. Then if people walk about, they tumble into them, and he goes round with his bow every morning to finish them off. When he has shot them dead, he climbs in and collects them for dinner. He can hoist himself out of a 10-foot pit quite easily." "Very well," said the Wart, and corrected himself. "I will be careful." Being invisible is not so pleasant as it sounds. After a few minutes of it, you forget where you last left your hands or legs, or at least you can only guess to within 3 or 4 inches. And the result is by no means easy to make your way through a brambly wood. You can see the brambles all right, but where exactly you are in relation to them becomes more confusing. The only guide to your legs, for the feeling in them soon becomes complicated, is by looking for your footprints. These you can see in the nearly flattened grass below you. And as for your arms and hands, it becomes hopeless unless you concentrate your mind to remember where you put them last. You can gradually tell where your body is, either by the unnatural bend of a thorn branch, or by the pain of one of its thorns, or by the strange feeling of centralness, which all human beings have because we keep our souls in the region of our liver. "Hold on," said Merlin, "and for glory's sake don't trip up." They proceeded to tread their tipsy way through the forest, staring carefully at the earth in front of them, in case it should give way, and stopping very often when an extra-large bramble fastened itself in their flesh. When Merlin was stuck with a bramble, he swore, and when he swore, he lost some of his concentration, and they both became dimly visible, like autumn mist. The rabbits upwind of them stood on their hind legs at this and exclaimed, "Good gracious!" "What are we going to do?" asked the wart. "Well," said Merlin, "here we are in the burbly water. You can see the giant's castle on the opposite bank, and we shall have to swim across. It may be difficult to walk when you are invisible, but to swim is perfectly impossible even with years of practice. You are always getting your nose under water, so I shall have to let go of you until we have swum across in our own time. Don't forget to meet me quickly on the other bank." The wart went down into the warm, starlit water, which ran musically like a real salmon stream, and struck out for the other side. He swam fast across the down-river with a kind of natural dog-stroke, and he had to go about a quarter of a mile below his landing-place along the bank before Merlin also came out to meet him. Dripping, Merlin swam the breaststroke very slowly and with great precision, watching ahead of him over the bow wave of his beard, with the faintly anxious expression of a faithful retriever. "Now," said Merlin, "catch hold again, and we'll see what Galapus is about." They walked invisibly across the sward, where many unhappy-looking gardeners with iron collars round their necks were mowing, weeding, and sweeping by torchlight, although it was so late in what had begun to be a garden, they were slaves. "Talk in whispers," said Merlin, "if you have to talk." There was a brick wall in front of them, with fruit trees nailed along it, and this they were forced to climb. They did so by the usual method of bending over, climbing on each other's backs, giving a hand up from on top, and so forth. But every time the wart was compelled to let go of the magician for a moment, he became visible. It was like an early cinematograph flickering very badly, or one of those magic lanterns where you put in slide after slide. A slave gardener, looking up at that part of the wall, sadly tapped himself on the head and went into the shrubbery to be sick. "Hush!" whispered Merlin from the top of the wall, and they looked down upon the giant in person as he took his evening ease by candlelight upon the bowling green. "But he's not so big at all," whispered Wart disappointedly. "He is 10 feet high," hissed Merlin, "and that is extremely big for a giant. I chose the best one I knew. Even Goliath was only 6 cubits in a span, or 9 feet 4 inches. If you don't like him, you can go home." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be ungrateful, Merlin. Only I thought they were 60 feet long and that sort of thing." 60 feet, sniffed the necromancer. The giant had heard something at the top of the wall and looked up toward them, remarking in a rumbling tone, "How the bats squeak at night!" Then he poured himself out another hornful of Madeira and tossed it off in one draught. Merlin lowered his voice and explained, "People find teeth and bones of creatures like your friend Atlantosaurus, and then they tell stories about human giants. One of them found a tooth weighing 200 ounces. It's dragons, not giants, that grow really big." "But can't humans grow big too?" "I don't understand it myself, but It is something about the composition of their bones. If a human were to grow 60 feet high, he would simply snap his bones with the weight of their own gravity. The biggest real giant was Eliza, and he was only 10 feet and a half. Well, said the ward, I must say it is rather a disappointment. I don't mean being brought to see him, he added hastily, but that they don't grow like I thought. Still, I suppose 10 feet is quite big when you come to think of it. It is twice as high as you are, said Merlin. You would come up to his navel, and he could pinch you up in a corn rick about as high as you can throw a sheaf. They had become interested in this discussion, so that they got less and less careful of their voices, and now the giant rose up out of his easy chair. He came toward them with a 3-gallon bottle of wine in his hand, and stared earnestly at the wall on which they were sitting. Then he threw the bottle at the wall rather to their left, and said in an angry voice, "Beastly screech owls!" and proceeded to stump off to the castle. "Follow him," said Merlin quickly. They scrambled down off the wall, joined hands, and hurried after the giant by the garden door. In the beginning, the downstairs parts were reasonably civilized, with green baize doors, behind which butlers and footmen, though with iron collars round their necks, were polishing silver and finishing off the decanters. Later on, there were strong rooms with ancient safes in them, which contained the various gold cups, epergnes, and other trophies won at jousts and horse races by the giant. Next, there were dismal cellars with cobwebs over the wine bins, and dreary-looking rats peeping thoughtfully at the bodiless footprints in the dust, and several corpses of human beings hanging up in the game cupboards until they should be ready to eat. It was like the place for adults only in the chamber of horrors at Madame Toussaint's. At the very bottom of the castle, they came upon the dungeons. Here, the chalky walls dripped with greasy moisture, and there were pathetic messages and graffiti scrawled upon the stone. "Pray for poor Priscilla," said one, and another said, "Oh, if only I had paid for my dog license honestly, this should never have come to pass." There was a picture of a man hanging from a gallows, with arms and legs sticking out like those of a Guy Fawkes in all directions, and another of a demon with horns. A fifth carving said, "Midnight Sun for the 2:30. While a sixth said, "Oh yeah?" and a seventh exclaimed, "Alas, I should have forgotten to feed my poor canary. Now I am in the same dread doom." A message which had been scratched out said, "Beastly old Gallopus loves Madam Mim, the dirty hound." And somebody else had written, "Repent and be saved, for the kingdom of hell is at hand." There were kisses, dates, pious ejaculations, mottos such as "Waste not, want not," and "Good night, ladies." Also hearts with arrows in them, skulls and crossbones, pictures of pigs drawn with the eyes shut, and pathetic messages such as, "Don't forget to take the potatoes off at 12:30. The key is under the geranium. Revenge me on striking Gallopus, by whom I am foully slain," or merely, "Mazawaddie mead for night starvation." It was a grimly place. And here we will pause.